thank you for inviting me here. A pleasure always to be in JNU. Now, I'm in one way very happy that Ajay and David have organized this conference, because in recent times, secularism seems to have disappeared from our public discourse. And whatever remains of secularism has been subjected to a considerable amount of disrespect, ribaldry, mockery, and, of course, abuse by cadres of the religious right. The near disappearance, for example, it's no longer pseudo-secular. You are called a secularist if you manage to portray yourself as committed to a concept called secularism. The near disappearance of a concept that informs us how a plural and a very hierarchical society can be organized is matter for some regret. It is also short-sighted because the opposite to secularism, the binary opposite to secularism, is not communalism. It is theocracy at worst and majoritarianism at best. At the same time, we have to recognize that the concept of secularism is in crisis. You know, when I look back at the 1980s and the 1990s, when the debate on secularism was at its peak, and most of us were responding to two scholars, T.N. Madan and Ashish Nandi, and feeling very anxious because they had said that India can never be secular. Why were we overreacting? Why were we overreacting? It's always good policy to interrogate a concept and to find out where it's gone wrong and where it's gone right. To investigate its historical antecedents, to investigate its trajectories, and foresee the possible near future and how it's going to shape up. The problem is, and when I look back at the 1990s, it strikes me that secularism in India has been subjected to a great deal of overuse. It has had to shoulder the onerous tasks of nation building and national integration, and any Supreme Court judgment will show you that they invariably link secularism, personal codes, and the question of national unity. It has to take on the politically explosive task of constructing a uniform civil code. It has to bear responsibility for inequality within communities. It has very often stood in for democracy, substituted for democracy in the political rhetoric of much of our political leadership, and now Ajay wants to make it a synonym for solidarity that will bring together various social movements. I want to suggest that secularism cannot bear this weight. It is a fragile concept. It is a concept in crisis because it has been overburdened. It cannot carry the weight of all the expectations, of all the hopes that have been invested in it. We can understand why those hopes were invested in secularism. India had undergone partition at the time of independence, but it might be unable to bear, and it has been unable to bear, the overload that has been placed on its slender shoulders. It is not a robust concept like democracy or even like justice. Even justice is problematic when you think in the period post-Rawls, how justice has come to substitute for democracy and how redistributive justice has come to substitute for equality of status. We have to re-examine the concept, and moments of crisis are moments of opportunities where we can look at where did we go wrong, 70 years of India's biography with secularism. We have to cut away theoretical flab, and we have to dispense with extravagant expectations that the concept arouses. It's become almost a descriptive concept. So you don't say somebody is not religious or or is an atheist, you say they are secular. It doesn't make sense to me. Secularism needs to be put in its place. We have to rescue secularism not only from its enemies, but also from its friends. And the first way we can perhaps go about this is by eschewing the whole theoretical exercise of measuring what is happening in India against the Western experience. In the West, secularism rose to power on the shoulders of secularization of society, or what Jose Casanova has called the privatization of religion. This has been proved an illusion, and Casanova himself has accepted that religion is no longer privatized. It has come into the public sphere, and Western scholars simply do not know what to do with religion. I mean, look at Habermas's attempts to bring religion into the public sphere in the interest of democracy and in the interest of creating a third language. But then he says at the point of where the public sphere gives way to the state, you must translate religious vocabularies into secular ones. Now, Western theorists never look at India. India is a case of exceptionalism. How did democracy in India succeed? That's the question. Not what democracy has become in India. But if they were to look at India, they will realize that political secularism was established in spirit, if not in words, in concepts, in terms of law, in terms of constitution till 1951, in a society that had been very deeply politicized over the issue of religion. And I'm not looking at the immediate history before partition, I'm looking back to the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, India witnesses a very historic encounter between a very largely decentralized Hinduism with its multiple deities and multiple modes of worship and multiple practices, many of them contradicted each other, and Judeo-Christian notions of religion. The notion that secularism is the product of the divided self. In India, however, thanks to the colonial intervention, religion becomes more, not less important. And there are 3 or 4 phases we might distinguish this into, and I'll quickly go over them. I don't have so much time. At the beginning of the 19th century, a number of agents of colonialism, and I use this phrase very, very deliberately, Indologists, who have become dismissively to be known as Orientalists in the aftermath of Edward Said. But let us call them Indologists because they were scholars with a great deal of expertise in their field. Colonial officials who wanted to make sense of this muddy and this messy society called India. And of course Christian missionaries. And the objectives of these 3 I'm giving, and of course they're Brahmin interlocutors and the Kaists who acted as interpreters. I'm not by no means ruling out Indian participation in the construction of a category called Hinduism. Now, whatever their motives might be, they resulted in a picture of India that was static because Orientalists or Indologists looked at texts. They looked at Brahmanical texts, they did not look at practice. With the result that Indian society came to be seen in most formulations, whether it's William Jones or Max Muller, you take up any other Indologist, as static, as timeless, as unchanging. So you have the very odd phenomena of Hegel, who has never read Sanskrit, who has never read an original Indian text, who is familiar with Indian philosophy because of the works of Indologists, a professor of philosophy at Berlin, giving lectures in Indian philosophy and history and saying India is the birthplace of civilization, but once philosophy moved away from the shores of India, India was static. It is ready for conquest. This is George William Frederick Hegel, who is supposed to be the philosopher of the Enlightenment, dedicated to human freedom. And you strike me, George William Frederick Hegel had never read about the debates in Indian philosophy, and he had never read somebody like Nagarjuna, which 3 generations of Kantians, Wittgensteinians, and Derridians had tried to appropriate. He was pre-Kant, 2nd century Buddhist philosopher. But he said India is ripe for conquest, and Christian missionaries, of course, had to know Hinduism in order to criticize it, and in response to this criticism of Hinduism being either static and unchanging or a primitive version, Indians, said Hegel, have never learned to separate philosophy and religion. They are primitive. Philosophy develops in the West, dedicated to human freedom. It does not develop in India. In response to these critiques of Hinduism, and it is Hinduism in the earlier part of the 19th century, several anxious responses by Indian intellectuals, beginning with Ram Mohan Roy, create a public sphere in which religion is discussed at the same point at which Europe is privatizing religion. For every institution that the Brahmo Samaj set up, there was a Pratna Samaj by the orthodox, by the conservatives, attacking Ram Roy. And then, of course, the various permutations and combinations of the Brahmo Samaj. I can warn non-Bengalis, the moment they get into Bengal Renaissance, their feet are firmly entangled. You can't get out of Bengal. It's impossible. But this creation of a public sphere, religion was not the only issue that was discussed. I am not by any means suggesting Indians were concerned about economic exploitation. But in the latter part of the 19th century, Hinduism is anchored firmly to the nationalist project. It comes to us from Maharashtra. And religion again becomes more or less important. And even if you look at an organization that is ostensibly secular, like the Indian National Congress, religion did not stray too far away from the deliberations, either on the caste question or on the position of women. How can you deal with these social practices which are iniquitous, which are inimical to the notion of freedom? So the notion of, without looking at the religion of Hinduism, but the religion that they were looking at was a colonial construct. Nobody looked at the tradition of challenges to Hinduism, the Bhakti movement, or Jainism, or Buddhism, or Sikhism, all the breakaways religions, or Jainism, or any of these religions that critique religion. They looked at Vedanta and create Advait Vedanta as the religion of the Hindu. That is, this Advait Vedanta that is taken up by the nationalist project from Raman Roy to Gandhi as Hinduism. Now, in a way, the creation of a public sphere in which religion has been politicized as a matter for public discourse, it is Gandhi who takes it to the rural areas. It is normally an urban phenomenon. Is the background against which the leaders of the Indian National Congress set out to conceptualize what a post-independence India would look like. Therefore, minority rights in the 1928 Motilal Nehru constitutional draft. Therefore, the promise of state neutrality in the 1931 Karachi Declaration of Human Rights, of rights. Human rights come much later. And oddly enough, despite all this banding about of the concept of secularism, secularism is never defined by the leaders of the freedom struggle and not even in the Constituent Assembly. I think Rochana Bajpai has shown us that debates on secularism actually come out from debates on minority rights and debates on the personal codes. So you have representatives of the Muslim community saying, how are you interfering in our personal codes? This is anti-secular. And why do you have minority rights? But nobody said what secularism was. And secularism, despite the efforts of K.T. Shah, was not made a part of the preamble. Secularism is clarified. What does the concept of secularism mean? I mean, it's a holy cow, but what does it mean? Clarified by Prime Minister Nehru in 1951 at the convocation address in Aligarh Muslim University, and he says three things. It doesn't mean a society where religion is discouraged. It means a society where people are encouraged to follow their religious persuasion. It also means the right not to be religious, but it means freedom of religion and equality of religions. Now, freedom and equality are notions that are strictly not secular. They are democratic. They are matters of civil liberties. You don't need secularism. And Casanova has again argued in a very recent article, why do you need secularism? Why do you need to separate religion from the state? You need civil liberties, you need freedom of religion. But the coming together of two formidable forms of power of religion of a majority community and political power was something that Pandit Nehru at least withdrew from. Secularism in the state where the state is not aligned to religion. You see, secularism comes up in India as a companion concept of democracy. Yes, you cannot separate democracy and secularism, and I will submit that secularism has to be put in its place as a part of democratic theory, as a part of the property of a democratic state. Now, very quickly, I'll go over what the experience of the coexistence of religion and secularism has been in India. You know, when Professor Jürgen Habermas speaks about the coexistence of religious and non-religious voices, he seems to assume that a certain amount of you can translate from one to the other. A lot of scholars from religious departments have said, how do you translate mystical experiences into secular vocabularies? And they are right. But I will go further and say that in India, the biography of the coexistence of religion and secularism has been extremely untidy. And that is the nature of politics, whether we like it or not. Secularism is not an answer to many things. In fact, nothing is an answer to anything. Political life is unpredictable and hazardous and contingent, and we have to use innovation and imagination to resolve our predicaments. In the first case, the Indian state took over two projects. The colonial project of regulating religion, and this goes back to the East India Company. Despite the fact that the East India Company at the last decade of the 18th century said we will not interfere in religion because they knew people were suspicious of Christianity, East India Company officials found they were saddled with the burden of expectations that people had had from the Mughal state, that the state will regulate religious denominations, regulate religious practices. Right up to 1830, when Macaulay's infamous minutes proclaim an end to fascination with Hinduism, East India Company officials are involved in rituals, whether it's throwing of coconut and begging forgiveness from the goddess, or taxing pilgrims, or ruling that in non-upper caste will not be allowed into Tirupati. And evangelists were saying, what are you guys doing? Why are you getting involved in religion? They were involved till 1830, and then follows the Queen's proclamation. We will not interfere in religion, and historians have showed us that actually the colonial state interfered much more in religion after 1858, in the interest of health, in the interest of sanitation, in the interest of restructuring of cities, in the age of consent bill, and of course in separate electorates, and of course community representation. This is the context in which the post-colonial Indian state takes on the improvement project of the colonial state. It also takes on the social reform project of the nationalist movement. Social reform, it was not religion, it was social reform. And the Supreme Court, except in the first decade, sets out to control religion. Particularly from Justice Gajendra Gadkar, who was in Herudian. So not only does it make a distinction between, between religion and non-religion, or between dharma and superstition, it also defines Hinduism. What is the Supreme Court doing defining religion? Right up till October 2016, when the court rules in a case involving the use of religious symbols in elections, saying religion and politics are not separate. This Indian state maintains equality. In the second case, two very incompatible practices live together, and I won't delve on them, Santhara and criminalizing suicide. Because the Indian state has been very pragmatic in maintaining a distance or intervening. It has not, the Supreme Court said, we will not criminalize Santhara. And in the third case, see how democracy has inspired subordinated sections within religious communities to stand up and ask for their rights. The Muslim Mahila Andolan, asking for a ban on triple talaq, entry into temples, entry into Haji Ali Dargah. It is not secularism that has motivated them, it is democracy. The right, and if you look at their petition, it's all Article 14, Article 19, Article 21. In these interests of these articles, we must have these rights. Finally, let me come to the last part. Shall we take another look at secularism? The proposition that India is a plural society is an empirical one. It has nothing to do with valuing each conception of the good or each mode of worship. The proposition that each way of being is of equal value is a normative one. And the empirical does not easily slide into the normative. Bridges have to be built, conceptual bridges, argumentative bridges, political bridges. And I will suggest that secularism is one of these bridges that maintains plurality, that maintains a multiple of religious identities in our community on the basis of equality, or even a weaker form of equality, non-discrimination. Secondly, we should make a distinction between secularization as a social process and secularism as a political concept, and perhaps break the link between the two. Thirdly, secularism is not concerned with personal faith, with ritual, or with theological questions of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It is concerned with deepening one aspect of democracy, plurality at a horizontal level. Fourthly, secularism is not a standalone concept. It is a companion concept of democracy. And democracy has the function of rightening injustices within religious communities. That's not the function of secularism. And you have to righten injustices, because unless you have democratic communities, secularists cannot defend undemocratic communities. So the dimension of secularism identified by Neera, I'm finishing, that the state shall not be aligned to one religion, and by that dimension maintain equality, is of immense importance. Now, what is equality is a different story altogether. I don't have time to go into it. Finally, the coexistence of religious and non-religious vocabularies in our public sphere is not by any means neat. It cannot be. Because there is a fundamental discrepancy between religion and secular languages. Religion gives to believers thick or comprehensive conceptions of the good that help them to make sense of the world. The concept of secularism is thin. It is not a thick concept. It establishes procedures that indicate what the place of religion in the public domain is and how people can pursue their faith unhampered by majoritarianism. It is a normative principle. The two languages pertain to two different sorts of goods, and they are not easy to translate. But that is the nature of our political life, or political life the world over. We are only confronted by irresolvable dilemmas that can be resolved not by recourse to thick conceptions of a concept, but through imagination, innovation, and a great deal of creativity. Thank you.